some of those entities might, if you like, be below the radar screen, may not be as evident to not just the ATO but to the general populace. Now, there are policy choices, I suppose, involved in deciding when is it appropriate to allow an entity to self-assess as the basis for accessing a particular concession. We're talking in the concession world here. There are other areas where it may not relate to accessing a concession, and when is it appropriate instead for particular processes to be set in place which require more active steps by the relevant entity to seek access to the concession by approaching the ATO and seeking some form of endorsement.
Okay, this might be for Mr. Hardy. The evidence we have from the UK Charities Commission is that they've got 460 employees with a budget of $29 million per annum. Oh, sorry, pounds, yeah, pounds, yep, pounds. Does make a difference. Not as much as it used to. What's the budget within ATO for charities, and how many employees are allocated to dealing with charity work? Not charity work, but
yes,
monitoring.
in terms of working on the not-for-profit sector.
Yeah.
There's the budget isn't a distinct line budget. There are about 65 staff that work in the not-for-profit area. They deal with matters of new applications for charitable or not-for-profit concessions, dealing with inquiries, people seeking private rulings about questions of status or interpretation of the law. They deal with quite a strong public information, public support and advice outwards function, and also with the risk monitoring and coordinating the review functions that we have as well. We can draw in, if necessary, some additional staff from time to time if we want to undertake a more involved review or something of that nature. But there's a standing staff level of about 65 staff that sort of look after the sector on a sort of fairly continuous basis.
It just seems to me that's not a very substantial amount of people when you're dealing with billions of dollars of public money. And if you take the example of the ABCC, 85 investigators for one sector of the building and construction industry, it just seems to me to beg a belief that there's only 65 staff. So how do you then monitor whether charities are doing the right thing?
In the absence of a distinct charity regulator, the tax office somewhat has to undertake some of the functions of assessing a new applicant if they have a charitable purpose, before we move on to perhaps the primary role of the tax office, which would be to grant the access to the tax concessions. And so primarily we look at the new applications that are people who approach us for endorsement, look to the nature of what they're going to provide. Does it fit within charity law, and then if it perhaps does so, does it fit into one of the concessional categories in the tax legislation that can be granted. We have then I guess as Mr. Wilcock was saying, there have been policy decisions from time to time with various governments and parliaments as to whether we seek charities and not-for-profits to provide regular information to the tax office, such as like an income tax return or something of that nature, which the decisions have been not to, in terms of the perceived impost on that sector. So working then with other forms of information that we can, we keep a monitoring eye on the sector, and if necessary we can go and make our outbound inquiries to an entity that seems to be perhaps showing evidence of drifting off its charitable purpose, and our inquiries can either lead to corrective action with that entity about changing their behaviour, or losing their endorsement if they're unable to move back into a charitable space. Can
I just maybe stop you there, because there's issues you've raised I want to try and pursue. So an assessment's made of a new applicant. So you would assume that every charitable organisation has been assessed at one stage or another?
Yes, I'd have to say historically, prior to the new tax system legislation changes in 2000, there was no specific requirement for charities to approach the tax office for any sort of endorsement regime. So at around that time, all of the pre-existing charities that had no formal endorsement by the tax office needed to be quickly brought into the system. I'd have to say that the speed and the expectations by which charities were brought into the endorsed system meant that perhaps the checking was more limited at that time on a risk-assessed basis. But yes, certainly since that time there has been more careful review of applications.
Okay, so there's been a more careful review of applications. What about monitoring? Explain to me how you, just before you do that, how many charities have been assessed, and is there a registry, is there a register within ATO?
All of the organisations that have been granted some sort of charitable tax concession are shown with that tax concession on the Australian Business Register. So that could compile the entirety of those organisations who have been granted endorsed status. There's about 55,000 organisations that have some sort of charitable tax concession endorsement. We receive about 6,000 applications per year, which are reviewed, and well, not all are successful, and not all are successful on their first iteration, but we often discuss with the organisation the purposes. They'll make adjustments, and they may in fact then subsequently meet charitable purpose, and that can be endorsed for tax concessions.
So how, if a charity applies for an endorsement, how many hours are involved in work for going through an endorsement? Is there an average?
There probably is an average, which I don't have at hand, but I could perhaps find that. It does vary. We do use a risk-assessed process in looking at the 6,000 applications. Some will be perhaps relatively straightforward where there's perhaps no hesitation or doubt about their charitable purpose and that they can meet clearly one of the legislative requirements of tax concessions. Others are less clear, and so there's more time spent in having a conversation with the applicant about further detail or understanding exactly what they do.
So 6,000 applications a year. Do you have any idea how many would fall into the tick the box, they're okay type approach? And I'm generalising, but
yes,
I don't know how else you would describe them.
Yes, tick the box is perhaps slightly too light, but yes, there is certainly a fast-tracked assessment process. Realistically, with the staff available and to work through the number of applications per year, perhaps in the order of 70% of applications are worked through the risk assessment as being relatively fast processed through the system. Some of those are tagged for subsequent after the event review, and then the remaining ones will be subject to more careful scrutiny upon application.
So that would be about 1,800 roughly, 30%?
Yes.
Roughly 1,800 would require scrutiny.
More involved in
more involved.
inquiry.
And what's more involved? Is that a day's work for an individual tax officer, or is it 3 days' work?
Again, that would vary in terms of the intensity, and of course it might, if you compressed it, be a day or 2 days' work. It might be, in fact, spread over several weeks of activity with the applicant.
So given that you've got 1,800 of them, it's quite a substantial amount of work that the tax office is undertaking with these.
When we need to, yes.
Yeah. So that's the fast track endorsement approach that we've dealt with. So a fair bit of work there. Then we come to monitoring, which is pretty important. How much effort's put into monitoring the charities that they are still charities and meet the requirements?
While we don't receive anything like an income tax return or an annual report for most charities. There is an exception, one particular exception category, which is private ancillary funds, but for most we don't. However, many charities access part of the GST system, so they lodge business activity statements, or they're part of the fringe benefits tax system, so they lodge fringe benefits tax returns. So we use information that we receive regularly from those avenues into our risk engine,